The wave of so-called Gen Z protests that have swept through countries in Asia has reached Africa, as frustrated young people, largely leaderless and coordinating themselves via social media, have hit the streets from Morocco to Madagascar demanding change. So in this video, we're going to explain these protests, particularly looking at Kenya, Madagascar and Morocco, what they want, whether they can succeed in securing change and ousting their governments, and where they might spread to next. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. Now, when we talk about Gen Z spearheading these largely decentralized protest movements, we're referring to the generation born from the mid to late 1990s through to the early 2010s. Although they obviously aren't the only generation present on the streets. And that's because the movements themselves have been pretty squarely aimed at political and economic elites, rather than simply being a case of young versus old. While the various movements have their own context, themes of economic grievances and political disenfranchisement are overarching, which Pangea-Risk advisory notes reflects a deeper breakdown in the social contract. Now, if you want to know more, you can check out our previous videos on the Asian Gen Z protests. But as a bit of background, it was Nepal that saw the highest profile protests so far, with mass youth-led demonstrations ousting the government, and with scenes of the parliament and other governmental buildings being set alight, viewed from around the world. With these scenes reminiscent of the uprisings in Bangladesh in 2024 and Sri Lanka in 2022. Gen Z protests also erupted this year in the Philippines amid anger over political corruption, as well as in Indonesia and Timor-Leste amid anger at perks afforded to politicians. So that's what was happening in Asia, but what's happening now in Africa? Well, in some ways, the idea that the Gen Z protest movement has spread to Africa is a little misleading, as mass youth-led protests in Kenya actually erupted last year, preceding the likes of Nepal. The largely decentralized protests during the summer of last year, under the label Reject Finance Bill 2024, were triggered by the government's proposed tax hikes. But there was also a lot of underlying frustration at the cost of living, inequality, poor economic opportunities, and governance. The demonstrations were huge, and even saw some protesters storm the Kenyan parliament, prompting President William Ruto to eventually back down and scrap the bill. However, with many of the underlying conditions unresolved, and anger at the deaths of protesters during last year's demonstrations, protests are primed to flare up again with the right trigger, as happened in June this year, following the death of a blogger in police custody. But as for the more recent Gen Z protests that have erupted in Africa since the ones in Asia, it's Madagascar that's perhaps gained the most attention, with them even mirroring Nepal in successfully ousting their leader. Gen Z protests broke out on the island of more than 30 million people in late September, triggered by chronic water shortages and power outages, but quickly snowballed into wider frustration at the government of President Andry Rajoelina. His efforts to quell the protests, including by replacing his entire government and asking for a year to solve the country's many issues, were not enough, and protesters were demanding his resignation and an apology for the at least 22 people killed during the unrest. With members of the armed forces joining protesters on the street over the weekend, Rajoelina, still refusing to resign, said a coup attempt was underway and was reportedly flown out of the country by the French Air Force. On Tuesday, Madagascar's parliament voted to impeach him, ignoring a dissolution decree that he'd issued shortly before the vote. Exactly what happens next remains to be seen, but the military now says that it's taken power, adding that it would manage a transition lasting up to 2 years alongside a civilian government before new elections could be held. At the same time, in North Africa, Morocco has also been gripped by Gen Z protests, dubbed Gen Z 212 after the country's telephone dialing code. Driven by frustration at underfunded healthcare and educational facilities, the movement was galvanized by the death of several women last month in a maternity ward, and protesters have pointed to the billions being spent in preparation for Morocco co-hosting the 2030 World Cup as evidence of misplaced priorities. The protesters have largely directed their anger at the elected government, calling for the Prime Minister's resignation, rather than at the Moroccan king. In fact, the leaderless Gen Z 212 collective published a letter to King Mohammed VI, urging him to dismiss the government, intervene against corrupt officials, push forward with reforms, and release detainees linked to peaceful protests. In a public address after the near-nightly protests, the king did not directly address the protesters and offered no indication that he'd sack the government or launch new corruption investigations. but he did say that improving healthcare and education, as well as creating jobs for young people, would be a priority, adding that there did not need to be competition between social programs and flagship projects like the World Cup. Now, we know that these movements are drawing at least some inspiration from each other, not least because of the use of the Gen Z label, but also because of shared symbols, most notably the pirate flag from the manga series One Piece, which has been adopted as a sort of unofficial symbol of the various movements, from Madagascar to Nepal to the Philippines. As so-called digital natives, Gen Z is well versed in harnessing social media platforms like Discord, Instagram, and TikTok, allowing for more spontaneous, decentralized, and leaderless movements, which can often pose a challenge for governments, as there isn't a clear leader to negotiate with, and the demands are sometimes more nebulous. That these decentralized protests are taking place through social media networks rather than established political parties or institutions also poses a challenge when governments are toppled, as what should come next is certainly a lot less clear-cut. That Africa, the most youthful continent, is seeing a wave of Gen Z protests is no surprise. Take a look at the population pyramids of Madagascar, Morocco, and Kenya, and you can see how a big chunk of the population are young. Countries with large, digitally connected, youthful populations that are facing poor economic opportunities, inequality, and corruption are fertile ground for Gen Z protest movements to spring up. Madagascar, for example, is one of the world's poorest countries, with 3/4 below the World Bank's poverty line. Morocco's youth unemployment rate is above 35%, and Kenyans have felt squeezed by austerity and rising taxes, aimed at paying off the country's substantial national debt. Existing issues and inequalities have also been exacerbated by events like the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, and all of the countries face more potential turmoil with the Trump administration's ending of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which threatens exports and jobs. Ultimately, there's a decent chance that the Gen Z protest movements continue to spread in Africa, and perhaps beyond. Gen Z protests have hit the streets of Peru, for instance. Places like Cameroon, Côte d'Ivoire, and Uganda, youthful, unequal countries where aged presidents are seeking to extend their hold on power at recent or upcoming elections, could be prime targets for Gen Z protests to spring up. The big question, though, is whether the promise and hope espoused by so many protesters can actually lead to effective and lasting change. Now, the situation in Madagascar is changing and updating fast, with more and more news outlets beginning to report on it. Right now, there are 305 sources reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the left. But if we dive a bit deeper, we can see that the left emphasizes the youth-led nature of the protest, while the right uses dramatic language like plunged into political chaos. This type of analysis is why Ground News has been my favourite way to stay up to date with the news since 2023, so I want to thank them for sponsoring this video. It's no secret by this point just how much we're fans of Ground News. They've been long-time supporters of this channel and independent news media at large. And that's because their app and website makes it easier to navigate the news. Ground News gathers thousands of articles worldwide in one place, so that you could easily compare how different outlets cover the same story. Each story comes with a visual breakdown on political bias, factuality, and who owns these sources. And it's not just me. Ground News has even been recognized by the Nobel Peace Center for its impact on media literacy. And speaking of bias, their brilliant blind spot feed allows you to fully expand your media bias and find stories that are disproportionately being covered by one side of the political spectrum or the other. After all, it's important to know the full story, and Ground News ensures you always will. If you're curious and committed to understanding what's really going on in the world, like we are, Ground News is the tool you've been looking for. And that's why we partner with them to give TLDR viewers 40% off their unlimited Vantage plan. You can subscribe through the link in the description, that's ground.news/TLDR, or by scanning the QR code on screen. And by subscribing, you're also supporting an independent news platform that's working to make the media landscape more transparent and balanced.